Reading aloud. 10-minute timer. I fell short this weekend, but it's okay. With regard to the superstitions of logicians, I shall never tire of emphasizing a small, terse fact which is unwillingly recognized by these credulous minds, namely, that a thought comes when it wishes and not when I wish, so that it is a perversion of the facts of the case to say that the object I is the condition of the predicate think. One thinks, but that is one is precisely the famous old ego is, to put it mildly, only a superstition, an assertion, and absurdly not an immediate certainty after all. One has even gone too far with this one thinks. Even the one contains an interpretation of the process and does not belong to the process itself. One infers here, according to the usual grammatical formula, to think is an activity. Every activity requires an agency that is active, consequently. It is pretty much on the same lines that the older atomism sought, besides the operating power in the material particle wherein it resides and out of which it operates, the atom. More rigorous minds, however, learnt it at last to get along without this earth-recedism, and perhaps someday we shall accustom ourselves, even from the logician's point of view, to get along with the little one to which worldly old ego has refined itself. It is certainly not the last charm of a theory that it is refutable. It is precisely thereby that it attracts the more subtle minds. It seems that the 100 times refuted theory of free will owes its persistence to this charm alone. Someone is always appearing who feels himself strong enough to refute it. Philosophers are accustomed to speak of the will as though it were the best known thing in the world. Indeed, Schopenhauer has given us to understand that the will alone is really known to us, absolutely and completely known, without deduction or addiction. But it again and again seems to me that in this case Schopenhauer also only did what philosophers are in the habit of doing. He seems to have adopted a popular prejudice and exaggerated it. Willing seems to me to be above all something complicated, something that is a unity only in the name, and that it is precisely a name in the popular prejudice lurks. And it is precisely in a name that popular prejudice lurks, which has gotten the mastery over the inadequate precautions of philosophers in all ages. So let us, for once, be more cautious. Let us be unphilosophical. Let us say that in all willing there is firstly a plurality of sensations, namely the sensation of the condition away from which we go, the sensation of the condition towards which we go, the sensation of this from and towards itself, and then besides an accompanying muscular sensation, which even without putting in motion arms and legs, commences its action by force of habit. Directly, we will anything. Therefore, just as sensations, indeed as many kinds of sensations, are to be recognized as the ingredients of the will, so, in the second place, thinking, it is also to be recognized in every act of the will there is a ruling thought. And let us not imagine it possible to sever this thought from the willing, as if the will would then remain over. In the third place, the will is not only a complex of sensation and thinking, but it is above all an emotion, and in the fact, the emotion of the command. that which is termed freedom of will is essentially the emotion of the supremacy in respect to him from who must obey. I am free. He must obey. This consciousness is inherent in every will, and equally so the straining of the attention, the straight look which fixes itself exclusively on one thing, the unconditional judgment that is, this and nothing else is necessary now, the inward certainty that obedience will be rendered in whatever else pertains to the position of the commander. A man who wills commands something within itself which renders obedience, or which he believes renders obedience. But now let us notice what is the strangest thing about the will, this affair so extremely complex for which the people only have one name. Inasmuch as the given circumstances, we are at the same time commanding and the obeying parties, and as the obeying party, we know the sensations of constraint, impulsion, pressure, resistance, and motion, which usually commence immediately after the act of will. Inasmuch as, the other hand, we are accustomed to disregard this duality and to deceive ourselves about it by means of synthetic term I. A whole series of erroneous conclusions and consequently of false judgments about the will itself has become attached to the act of willing, to such a degree that he only who wills believes firmly that willing suffices for action, since in the majority of cases there has only been exercise of will when in the effect of the command, consequently obedience and therefore action, was to be expected, and the appearance has translated itself into the sentiment, as if there were a necessity of effect. In a word, he who wills believes with a fair amount of certainty that will and action are somehow one. He ascribes the success, the carrying out of the willing, to the will itself, and thereby enjoys an increase of the sensation of power which accompanies all success. Freedom of will, that is the expression for the complex state of delight of the person exercising volition, who commands and at the same time identifies himself with the executor of the order, who, as such, enjoys also the triumph over obstacles, but thinks within himself that it was really his own will that overcame them. In this way, the person exercising volition adds the feelings of delight of his successful executive instruments, the useful under-wills, or under-souls indeed. Our body is but a social structure composed of many souls, to his feelings of delight as commander. L'effet c'est moi. What happens here is what happens in every well-constructed and happy commonwealth, namely, that the governing class identifies itself with the successes of the commonwealth. In all willing, it is absolutely a question of commanding and obeying, on the basis, it is already said, of a social structure composed of many souls, on which account a philosopher should claim the right to include willing as such within the sphere of morals, regarded as the doctrine of the relations of supremacy under which the phenomenon of life manifests itself. That the separate philosophical ideas are not anything optional or autonomously evolving, but grow up in a connection and relationship with each other. That, however, suddenly and arbitrarily they seem to appear in the history of thought, they nevertheless belong just as much to a system as the collective members of the fauna of a continent is betrayed in the end by the circumstance, how unfailingly the most diverse philosophers always fill in again a definite fundamental scheme of possible philosophies. Under an invisible spell, they always revolve once more in the same orbit. However, independent of each other, they may feel themselves with their critical or systematic wills. Something within them leads them. Something impels them in definite order, the one after the other. I accidentally pressed pause. the definite order. Something impels them in the definite order, the one after the other, to wit, the innate mythology of a relationship of their ideas. Their thinking is, in fact, far less a discovery than a re-recognizing, a remembering, a return, and a homecoming to a far-off, ancient common household of the soul, out of which those ideas formerly grew. Philosophizing is so far a kind of atavism of the highest order. The wonderful family resemblance of all Indian, Greek, and German philosophizing is easily enough explained. In fact, where there is affinity of language, owing to the common philosophy of grammar. I mean, owing to the unconscious domination and guidance of similar grammatical functions. It cannot but be that everything is prepared at the outset for a similar development and succession of philosophical systems, just as the way seems barred against certain other possibilities of word interpretation. It is highly probable that philosophers within the domain of the Earl-Attic languages look otherwise into the world, and will be found on paths of thought different from those of the Indo-Germans and Muslimans. The spell of certain grammatical function is ultimately also the spell of psychological valuations and radical conditions. So much by the way of rejecting Locke's superficiality with regard to the origin of ideas. The causa sui is the best self-contraction that has yet been conceived. It is sort of a logical violation and unnaturalist, but the extravagant pride of man has managed to entangle itself profoundly and frightfully with this very folly. The desire for freedom of will in the superlative metaphysical sense, such as still holds sway, unfortunately, in the minds of the half-educated, the desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions, oneself, and to absolve God in the world, ancestors, chance, and society, therefrom involves nothing less than to be precisely this causa sui, and with more than Muschen daring to pull oneself up to the existence by the hair of the slough of nothingness. If any one should find out in this manner the crass stupidity of the celebrated conception of free will and put it out of its head altogether, I beg of him to carry this enlightenment a step further, and also put this out of his head. The contrary of this monstrous conception of free will, I mean non-free will, which is tantamount to a misuse of cause and effect. One could not wrongly materialize cause and effect as the natural philosophers do. According to the prevailing mechanical doltishness, which makes the cause press and push until its effects end. One could use cause and effect only as pure conceptions, that is to say, as conventional fictions for the purpose of designation and mutual understanding, not for explanation. In being in itself, there is nothing of casual connection, of necessity, or of psychological non-freedom. There the effect does not follow the cause. Their law does not obtain. That is, we alone who have devised cause, sequence, reciprocity, relatively, constraint, number, law, freedom, motive, and purpose. And when we interpret and intermix this symbol world as being in itself, with things we act once more as we have always acted, mythologically. The non-free will is mythology in real life. It is only a question of strong and weak wills. It is almost always a symptom of what is lacking in itself. When a thinker, in every casual connection and psychological necessity, manifests something of compulsion indignance, Indigence, a level of poverty in which real hardship and deprivation are suffered and comforts of life are wholly lacking. Indigence manifests something of compulsion, indigence, obsequentness, oppression, and non-freedom. It is superstitious to have such feelings. The person betrays himself, and in general, if I have observed correctly, the non-freedom of will is regarded as a problem from two entirely opposite standpoints, but always in a profoundly personal manner. Some will not give up their responsibility, their belief in themselves, the personal right to their merits at any price. Others, on the contrary, do not wish to be answerable for anything or blamed for anything, and owing to an inward self-concept to seek to get out of the business, no matter how. The latter, when they write books, are in the habit at present of taking the side of criminals. A sort of scholastic sympathy is their favorite disguise, and as a matter of fact, the fatalism of the weak-willed embellishes itself surprisingly when it can pose as a la religion de la souffrance humaine, that is, good taste. Okay. Oh, F it. Let's go to Free Spirit. Let me be pardoned as an old psychologist who cannot desist from the mischief of putting his finger on bad modes of interpretation, but nature's conformity to law, of which you physicists talk so proudly, as though. Why it exists only knowing to your interpretation and bad philology. Why am I completely blanking on how to pronounce this? And it's giving me an ad, of course. Of course. Very nice day outside, though. Philology. As bad philology. It is no matter of fact, no text, but rather just a natively humanitarian adjustment and preservation of meaning with which you make abundant concessions to the dramatic instincts of the modern soul. Everywhere equally before the law, nature is not different in that respect, nor better than we, a fine instance of secret motive in which the vulgar antagonism to every privileged and ocratic likewise. A second and more refined atheism is once more disguised need something, different language. That also is what you want. Therefore, cheers for natural law, is it not so? But as it has been said that it is interpretation, not text. And somebody might come along who, with the opposite intentions and modes of interpretation, could read out of the same nature and with regard to the same phenomena, just as the tyrannically inconsiderate and relentless enforcement of the claims of power, an interpreter who should so place the unexceptionalness and unconditionalness of all will to power before your eyes, that almost every word, and the word tyranny itself, would eventually seem unsuitable, or like a weakening and softening metaphor as being too human, and who should nevertheless, by asserting the same amount this world as you do, namely that it has a necessary and calculable, of course, however, because laws obtain it, but because they are absolutely lacking, and every power affects this ultimate consequentness every moment. Granted that this is only an interpretation, and you will be eager enough to make this objection. Well, so much the better. All psychology here thou has run aground on moral prejudices and timidness. It has not dared to launch out into the depths, and so far it is allowable to recognize in that which has hitherto been written, evidence of which has hitherto been kept silent. It seems as if nobody has yet harbored the notion of psychology as the morphology and development doctrine of the will to power, as I conceive of it. The power of moral prejudices has penetrated deeply into the most intellectual world. The world, apparently most indifferent and unpredicated, has obviously operated in an injurious, obstructive, blinding, and disorienting manner. A proper psychology has contended with the unconscious agnotism in the heart of the investigator. It has the heart against it, even a doctrine of the reciprocal doctrine of the reciprocal conditionalness of the good and the bad impulses, causes as refined immortality, distresses and aversion, and a still strong and manly conscience. Still more so, a doctrine of the deprivation of all good impulses from the bad ones. If, however, a person should regard in the emotions of hatred, envy, covetousness, and imperiousness as a life-conditioning emotions, as factors of which must be present fundamentally and essentially in the general economy of life, he will suffer from such a view of things as from the sea-sickness. And yet this hypothesis is far from being the strangest and most painful in this immense and almost new domain of dangerous knowledge. And there are in fact 100 good reasons why everyone should keep away from it who can do so. On the other hand, if one has once drifted hither from one's bark, well, very good. Now let us set our teeth firmly. Let us open our eyes and keep our hand fast on the helm. We sail away right over mortality. We crush out. We destroy perhaps the remains of our own mortality by daring to make our voyage thither. But what do we matter? Never yet did a profounder word of insight reveal itself into daring travelers and adventurers, in the psychologist who thus makes a sacrifice, and it is not the sacrificio del intelligio. On the contrary, will at least be entitled to demand a return that psychology shall once more be recognized as the queen of the sciences, for whose service and equipment the other sciences exist. For psychology is once more the path to fundamental problems. And that is chapter 1, I guess, if you want to call it chapter, completed. We begin on 2, which is called The Free Spirit, tomorrow. Very nice day outside. Love reading outside. Loud.